Hello, this is John, and welcome back to Dr. Hollowed. Today we're doing a 1 hour video. Uncanny, creepy, terrifying moments that felt straight out of a horror movie. Like and subscribe if you enjoy the video.
I was working the late shift at this facility and about 1 a.m. I was closing up the building for the night. The place had about 40 doors and I had to go around to make sure all of them were locked, which I did. Then I went to set the alarm system, but I had one door that was showing a fault on the system, so I walked to the far end of the building to check that door and lock it. As I pulled up on the crash bar, I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the darkness beyond the door, so I looked up and there was a man directly on the other side of the glass staring at me. Our faces were less than 2 feet apart, separated only by the glass of the door. He just stared. I turned and ran back through the building, set the alarm, ran out, jumped in my car and hauled ass out of there. No idea what he was doing there in this isolated area in the middle of the night. It was a full moon a couple months ago. I was staying with a close friend, Elle, at her dad's house, which is a tiny, but very quaint and cozy beach cottage a couple blocks from the ocean. The house is the guest house of the front property, so we were all sleeping in one large room on different beds. We had fallen asleep soundly, but suddenly I woke up in the middle of the night, and as I open my eyes I see that Elle is wide awake too. The room has 3 large skylights, so the moonlight is shining brightly onto us. It was eerily clear that night and you could see all the stars. We end up talking about all sorts of very morbid topics, mainly on disease, war, starvation, and the fragility of understanding human consciousness. You know, normal 3:33 a.m. type of conversations to have in the dark. We end up talking about how factory farmed meat that gets fed to us is so horrific, and how bad the shit that gets fed to pets must be. The conversation somehow got onto the topic of being watched through the skylights, after discussing UFOs and aliens. Right after we brought that up, Elle looks at me with absolute horror in her eyes and face, and her mouth dropped open. Scared, silent, finger pointed directly up and behind me, she managed to whisper, "Look behind you." Adrenaline was pumping through me as I couldn't imagine what the fuck could be instigating that sort of reaction, especially after all the spooky stuff we had just been talking about. I managed to turn my head around and look up at the skylight, and I jumped about 3 feet in the air off the bed and screamed bloody murder. 2 yellow eyes were peering in from the skylight, and then a small dark figure they belonged to scurried away. Elle and I looked back at each other and held each other, and then we started breathing shakily and Elle started laughing. Scared shitless, I was like, "WTF was that?" "It was a cat," Elle concluded. Regardless if it was a cat or not, it totally could have been. Cats can climb high roofs. I'll never forget the look on her face and the terror surrounding the slow turnaround to see eyes staring at us in the above window in the moonlight. Cat or not, creepy as fuck. I was using the bathroom at a mall a couple years ago during Halloween. It was about closing time and I was in a stall when I heard the door open and a guy came in walking really slow. He kept walking until he was literally outside of my stall. He had on huge red shoes. I was pretty confused at this point, so I said, "Hey, someone's in here." He didn't say anything, so I finished and then went to open the stall door. He was dressed as a creepy clown with makeup and everything. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. I thought he was a bit slow or that he was just trying to be creepy, so I just walked by him and washed my hands, then left. A couple days later I was watching the news and saw that a guy was arrested for dressing up as a clown and stabbing PPL at the parking lot of the same mall. I was absolutely taken aback. Yes, it really happened. Yes, I was very young, and yes, the proof was seen by my parents. Here is the story. It was storming one night, thunder, lightning and rain. Nasty. Storms that bad scared me so bad back then that I would either go sleep with my parents or pull the comforter down to the floor, throw a pillow under the bed and sleep there. This time I was going to sleep under the bed. I went to my parents' room, but they said I was getting a little too big for that. I don't know about that. In retrospect, I just think they wanted to have sex, but what do I know? All I know is I was petrified. I went back to my room hoping to get some sleep. I closed my door and, as cliche as it sounds, as soon as that happened, there was a flash of lightning and, at the same time, a face appeared at my window. My effing bedroom window, where I had to sleep. Man, I never got under my bed so fast in my life. I left my lights on that night, as if I had to say it. The next morning I told my parents what happened. They said that it must have been very frightening for me, but they will prove no one was outside my window last night. We went outside and not only were there footprints underneath my window, but they walked for a few steps and started running towards the woods where they obviously stopped. Creepy. Very creepy. I used to work the overnight shift in a radio station. We were in a smallish building in the middle of a paddock. Middle of the night, a kangaroo jumped through the glass window in the sales/commercial library office and went on a rampage through the office. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I just know I was sitting there with my feet up on the desk doing my homework, with my dog asleep beside me, when there was this massive crash, the sound of equipment being smashed, followed by heavy thudding down the corridor, and a deep grunting/growling. And my dog went mental and took off chasing something. When I went out of the studio to have a look, there was a trail of blood up the corridor. And outside I could hear gunfire. It took me more time than it should have to think kangaroo escaping roo shooters and not zombie apocalypse. From the UK here, but basically I live out in the countryside and was coming back from a long walk out in the fields. It was pretty much pitch black, but I was only about 2 minutes walk away from my car. I was in sort of long grass when all of a sudden I heard something, sounded the size of a dog, come running straight at me through the grass. You could really hear the thuds of its footsteps. So I froze and screamed towards its direction and the footsteps stopped. They then started to slowly circle me in this field, like whatever it was stalking me. It went around the back of me and so I sprinted as fast I could and got back to the car. Feeling safe, I caught my breath, locked the door and turned the ignition on. The headlights came on and were perfectly lighting up the corpse of a rabbit with no head laid directly in front of the car. I got out of there as quick as possible. Was more than likely just a badger, but my God, it felt like a horror movie. It was about 43 years ago when my mother had decided she was through with the man, my little sister's father, that we were living with. So we loaded into the car and made our way from a tiny little backwoods Montana town to a tiny little backwoods Oregon coast town. For a while, we stayed with my mother's friend and her family. But after a few weeks, Mom had found us a place to stay that would be our own. At least for a while. This was the summer before my becoming a third grader. Right around 1980. Our new home was an old travel trailer. You know, the kind that you would tow behind a pickup truck to go camping in the woods. The sofa/dining area became Mom's bed, and there was a small set of bunk beds for my sister and I. It really wasn't much, but we made it our home. Chris was the property owner, and the trailer was parked on his property, about 30 yards from the house. There were a few old junker vehicles around. He had a couple of mean-ass dogs, and one of them eventually ripped an eyeball out of my sister's new puppy because the pup had approached the food dish. There were train tracks right behind the trailer. Hell, I mean right behind. Maybe 15 to 20 yards away. And trains ran those tracks multiple times per day. And night. Not ideal by any means. I'm going to pause here to provide you with some interesting information that I had later discovered. Keep in mind that I did not know any of this at the time. 1. Just prior to our moving in, Chris's father had blown his brains out in our happy little home. If the interior had been painted, instead of that nasty ass wood paneling, then the new paint would have barely been dried when we moved in. 2. Just about 100 yards into the woods north of us was an old cemetery. I've been there as an adult, and it's horrific. Old rusted out shells of long dead cars have been abandoned in the midst of old forgotten plots. Some of which have headstones so worn as to be unreadable. Some random assholes had decided this was a great place to toss their trash. So things like old mattresses and dryers were left among the dead as well. Simply disgusting. However, the reason I had visited this cemetery was because I had heard that certain rituals had once occurred there. I was looking to see if I could find any evidence of this. 3. As an adult, I learned that my little sister heard the same noises that I did at night. Returning to 1980. After going to bed each night, just as I was drifting in that place between consciousness and the realm of sleep, I would hear this startling sound. It was the chuffing cough of a large dog snapping its fangs together in the air mere inches from my ear. I slept in the top bunk, and the sound always came from the wall side. When I think about it to this day, I can still remember that sound. Mom brushed it off as nightmares, and would just send me back to bed each night. I don't think she ever really believed me. So I just stopped going to her about it, and would lay there, afraid to fall asleep, but eventually doing so. Only to be awakened by the snap yet again. I wonder if I had just become used to it, because the impression of this just sort of fades away into memory. However, this wasn't the only sleep-related oddity floating around back then. According to Mom, I had suddenly become quite the sleepwalker. I would randomly get out of bed, grab some toys, and start playing with them. Or I would just walk over to Mom and engage in conversation with her, but starting in the middle of it, as if I were already in discussion with someone else. She later told me that this had freaked her the hell out. Well, one late night, I just got out of bed and went to the front, and only, door, grabbed the knob, and was getting ready to head outside. Mom, being still awake and right there by the door, asked me just what did I think I was doing. I told her that I needed to go to Tommy's house to play. Being fairly used to this by now, my mother simply tried to redirect me back to bed. At this point, I dodged her attempt, scrambled onto her bed, said, "But look, Mom," and opened the curtains. Tommy was my friend that lived across the street. Tommy's house was fully engulfed in flames. Fortunately, nobody was home that night, as their family was out of town. The house was burned to the ground before the fire department ever arrived. What made me want to go to Tommy's house? What made those horrible dog noises in my ear? Yes, my sister and I had each received a new pup. But they were smaller dogs, not capable of the nightly climb up to the top bunk to snap in my ear, then disappear. Also, after living with us for a few short months, both dogs failed to come when called to breakfast one morning. It was summer, and the trailer was small, so the dogs slept outside. They were pups, but about a year old from what I remember. And the yard was fenced along the street. After a short search, I found the dogs in the road. They were both dead, apparently having been run over by a drunk or malicious driver. One in each lane. Used to live next to the biggest and oldest cemetery in a very big city. I remember going back home one late evening, alone and by foot. The street was completely empty and dead silent, probably due to the very thick fog blanketing everything. I couldn't see anything past a couple of feet. I heard a very distinctive cry and slowed down, only to see a crow land right next to me. It kept silent and walked by my side for a while, until I took the turn to my apartment and it disappeared into the fog, straight ahead and into the direction of the cemetery. I wouldn't call this moment creepy or uncanny, exactly, but I definitely felt like I'd been walking into a cliché movie scene at that moment. My dad used to work on oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. One day, his harness failed him and he fell into the water. It was a miracle he was saved based on the choppy water and the fact that they used to dump their leftover food into the water. This made sharks an issue. Fast forward to 30 years later when our family went to Puerto Rico. On our first day at the beach, my dad and I got caught in a riptide. We had boogie boards, so when I went under, it wrapped around my neck. My dad was able to make it out and watched in horror as I was beaten by the waves and current. Clearly I made it out, but it reminded me of the movie Final Destination. Death skipped my dad and landed on me, almost. Death by water nonetheless. It was the scariest moment of my life and my wife didn't even know since she was on shore. Imagine dying on the first day of vacation. Lol. Couple of years ago a buddy of mine put 2 spare tires on the front of his car to drive around and do burnouts. This was late at night. Our other friend was in his car and I was following in my car with my brother in the passenger seat. Drove down to a local beach because my friend thought they had a concrete pad at the end of the beach road he could do burnouts on. On the way down we drove past a guy in an SUV parked at the beach taking some stuff out of his car. He had a stool and some other random stuff. He watched as we drove by but we didn't think much of it. Got to the end of the beach and there was no concrete pad, so turned around and drove back out. As we drove by the SUV guy with the stool, he was just standing there staring as we drove by and there was something on the stool this time. He turned the object on the stool around to face us and it was a doll in an all black dress with a black veil and white face, about 3 feet tall. Basically looked like the nun from the Conjuring movies but a bit different. My brother and I just started screaming and I started flooring it. My friend was still in front of us in his car, so I was beeping and waving to get him to go. The 2 of them in the other car saw the guy on the way in but weren't looking on the way out, so they had no idea why we were freaking out. Lol. Eventually got out of the beach road and just drove home. Still don't know what the hell the guy with the doll was doing. He had what looked like an easel for painting and the sky was clear that night, so only thing I could think of is he was trying to make a creeping painting. Must have saw us and thought it would be funny to scare us or something. Haven't gone back to that beach since. Lol. Myself and some friends witnessed weird stuff before on another road a couple kilometers from where this beach was, so might just be some weirdos living down there. Ha. In high school my boyfriend at the time and I would drive random back roads after school to explore/walk the rural desert of Arizona. Small boring town, nothing to do and nothing ever out of the ordinary to report on besides the random drug cases, so we don't scare very easily. These trips would easily last for hours and go well into the night. You'd almost never encounter other people besides the random camper or local Forest Service driving the other way. One late night we're driving back to town out of a dirt road. I had a shifty car with a broken radio, so I'm rolling about 5 miles per hour to avoid potholes and rocks, and all you can really hear is the gravel crunching under the tires. Our conversation goes silent when I think we both feel the weird chill of something's off settle in the air. It's pitch black besides the weak headlights lighting the dirt road, when we see one round headlight on side of the road off in the distance. It's so bright I think it might be a motorcycle, but I remember it hovering in the space unmoving while I have to slowly approach. We're both focused in on this light when I start to make out the figure of a tall man. Maybe a late night hiker? I thought, but his lamp was mounted on what looked like an old-fashioned miner helmet, and he wasn't moving, just facing my approaching car. I gently start moving as far to the left side of the road to get some distance when I know I'll have to pass him. I make out some more features and he's dressed top to bottom in old-fashioned mining gear, what looked like a tattered long-sleeve work shirt, some heavy work overalls, really tall waders, and he's holding a crowbar. My only logical explanation is maybe homeless, as I also notice a large old backpack on his back. But I don't even have time to think logically when, as we start to pass, my headlights lit up his skin, patches of black on his arms, and it appears to be steaming, still unmoving when he turns his headlamp to watch us. We can't help but stare out of the passenger side window hoping to make out his face, when he starts moving towards us, long deliberate strides, crowbar slowly being raised. I gas it, letting my bumper hit every rock while my BF turns to watch behind us, the bright headlamp fading, but never moving in the distance. To this day I don't really believe in the paranormal, but we lived next to a historic mining area and our only explanation is a long dead miner came back as a ghost to wander the abandoned area when he saw a car for the first time and tried to attack it. Lol. I remember being 7 years old, me and my sister would go up this steep road with our skateboards, sit down on them and ride down on the path. One day we went down the path and at the bottom of the road it has a huge turn. So as we were going down, a bus was next to us and we couldn't turn, and as soon as the bus turned, we nearly went straight into it and the bus slammed on the brakes. Someone on that bus knew my dad, so they called him and told him what happened. When me and my sister got home, my dad told us that we have killed 2 people on the bus because of what we did. We felt ashamed, heartbroken knowing we killed people, until we turned 18 and my dad said, "You didn't really kill anyone. I have never felt so much anger in my life. I was made to believe that I killed innocent people for most of my teenage life." A man stopped me in a grocery store parking lot and asked for a ride. He said he didn't have a car. I told him I don't give rides, especially that late at night. He wouldn't drop it. He asked me if I had any gas money and I told him I had no cash on me. He told me he needed to go home, which is by X Dairy Factory. He started rambling and I was afraid if I unlocked my car, he'd jump in. After a few minutes and a few more times of saying no quite firmly, he told me he could give me gas money if I took him. I told him, "I don't know you. I'm not trying to be ugly, but it's late. I'm a woman. I don't know you." He finally walked away, but as he literally said, "It's not like I was trying to rape you." Which really shook me up. Got in my car and quickly locked the doors. Went over the conversation again. If he had gas money, why did he want gas money? If he didn't have a car, why would he need gas money to begin with? And also, that dairy factory closed down almost 10 years prior. It's in a crowded area, yeah. But it's mostly warehouses, farmland, and other factories. It's an area that doesn't have houses on the edge of town. I feel like I really dodged a bullet that night. Especially after the last thing he said to me before finally leaving me alone. 2 things, and they both happened within a few days of each other. Never had any creepy experiences in my life before or after. June 2019 I went to New York, then on to St. Lucia for my 30th birthday celebration. We hadn't actually planned to go to St. Lucia but didn't like New York, so thought we would go on somewhere with a reasonable flight time and ticket price. The night before we were due to get an early flight from JFK to St. Lucia, my husband and I checked into a budget travel lodge style hotel that offered a shuttle service to JFK Airport. When I walked into our room, I got the strangest feeling about the hotel. Something felt off. With not much to do and an early start, I more or less brushed my teeth for bed soon after arriving. I noticed my new glasses I had bought earlier that day were missing from my bedside table, and my husband had bought a few white t-shirts from H&M that day which also went missing. We were utterly perplexed but eventually had to stop looking and get to bed. Some hours later at about 3 a.m., I was lying on my side and what felt like someone's finger moved down my spine, making me jump. I felt such a sinister feeling in that room, as if there was a dark cloud around me. I turned to see if it was my husband, but he was also on his side with his back to me, fast asleep. I was so on edge and lay there for about 10 minutes too scared to move. Then my husband said out of nowhere, in the pitch black room, "Are you okay?" I was surprised he even knew I was awake and asked why he had asked, and he said he just had such a strange dream that I was running terrified and an old woman was trying to grab me with her hands as I ran by. The following day we arrived in St. Lucia and all was fine in our hilltop Airbnb for a few days. One night though I decided to read my book in one of the bedrooms, one which had a big beautiful 4-poster bed. Within minutes and out of nowhere, I became so drowsy I don't remember much else. I woke up some time later to my husband standing by the bed looking puzzled. Basically, there had been a 3-hour electricity blackout on that side of the island. He walked into my room using his phone as a light to check I was okay, because he'd expected me to shout for him and get frightened. To his surprise, I was fast asleep on the bed, with a lamp by my bed on. He tried the other lights in the room and no luck, nowhere else in the house had electricity. He kept checking on me but I was completely out of it. As soon as the lights came on again, I woke up as if an on button had been pressed. It's as if someone had knocked me unconscious from the moment the blackout happened to moments after it finished. Funnily enough, St. Lucia itself had such a dark atmosphere to me, despite being such a popular island for honeymoons and weddings. 2 months later my neighbor's husband died on the island in a freak accident too. Anyway, regarding the electricity event, my husband describes it as a positive experience where I was being protected, which is a nice interpretation. I'm not sure how I feel though. I checked into my hotel room for a work trip. Ordered room service, ate, watched a little TV, turned out the light pretty early, because I had a big presentation in the morning. Went to sleep immediately. I generally sleep quite soundly. Any my family jokes that I'd sleep through a tornado. I'm often asked, what about that storm last night? What storm? I slept through it. At some point I wake up, thinking I heard the door open and shut, and there's light briefly in the room. I turn over, still mostly asleep, thinking it's the door across the hall or next door, and maybe headlights coming in through the window. But then I hear rustling in the room, and the other bed creaking a little bit. I sit bolt upright and switch on the light. There's a guy sitting on the edge of the other bed, slipping off his shoes. Somehow the front desk checked him into my same room and activated his card key. Never been so freaked out in my life. But he was just as scared as I was. I always wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up and in the morning had a strange guy asleep in the next bed. One year in the ocean at the beach trip with family, I had watched an episode of Shark Week the night before I entered the water. I was in 4 or 5 feet of water at the most and vividly remembered the Shark Week television program from the night before, which stated, "Do not splash or a shark will be attracted to you," specifically frantic splashing like a fish would make in distress. I was the only one in the water, the skies were cloud covered and I started splashing, bored. I thought, maybe a shark will come like a fool. I did this for a good 10 minutes. I was past the breaking waves. Over the next wave I could see the shore and my family on the beach. My mother waved to me and yelled for me to come back in. I dismissed her. Another minute went by, I splashed like a fish. I heard her voice a second time from the shore. I still out a good 30 yards as I was swimming on the east coast, continued to splash. She yelled for me to come in. She looked up from her book again. I dismissed her. I began splashing again, like a fool. She yelled another time, a third and final time. A soft, calm yell, not an order but a request. She requested I come in from the water with a gentle wave from her seat of safety on the beach. For some reason this time, I listened to her, really listened instead of hearing. I decided on my own accord to come back to shore. There were no real waves to surf nor did I have a surfboard anyway. I began to swim back to shore. My feet already touched the sandy bottom so only the pull of the rip tide worked against me as I made my way into shallow water. After a 10-minute walk/swim back to shore I walked out of the water with one last splash. Tired, I made my way to her chair where my mom was reading a book. I said, "Why did you call me in?" She looked up from reading her book for a moment. "I didn't," she said with a curious look. I sort of smiled, confused. I was so sure she did. I shrugged her off and looked back to the ocean. I was ready to go back in and continue my swim. I froze when my eyes met the ocean. In the exact spot I was splashing and swimming, past the breaking waves, was 3 large sharks thrashing about. From the dorsal fin to the tail fin, the biggest shark had to have been 8 feet long. The other 2 at least 6 feet long. I was horrified. If I was still in the water I would have been torn to pieces by the 3 sharks. I pointed and my mom and rest of the family saw the sharks. No one else went into the water again that day. I sometimes wonder if the 8-foot shark was really 10 feet long. It is hard to tell from the beach. I never used to believe in cryptids. I heard stories about them and thought they were cool, but always told myself there's no way. A few months ago my boyfriend and I take my dog outside to use the bathroom. It's probably around 2 to 3 in the morning and we're both having trouble sleeping so we decide to smoke on my back porch. After being outside for probably about 5 to 10 minutes, out of nowhere, it gets super cold. All of the crickets stop chirping and the early morning birds follow suit. The only noise is the wind blowing in the trees. Suddenly, There comes what can only be described as a barking noise about 60 feet from my house. It's quiet at first, but it doesn't take long before we can both hear it without straining our ears. It gets louder, but I can't see the source of the noise due to obstacles obscuring my sight in that direction. It just keeps repeating the same sound over and over, like a recording, about every 15 seconds. It sounds the same every time, and that's what makes my hair stand on end. My neighbors have dogs, but they're all Chihuahuas and Yorkies. Even if they were big dogs, I don't think this is a big dog. I don't know what it is, but it sounds fake. I don't know, it's hard to explain, you just had to be there. My boyfriend and I get too creeped out and put out what we're smoking, call in my dog, and go to bed. The same thing happened the next night. We couldn't sleep again, so we took my dog out at around the same time as last night. The noise starts up almost immediately. It's faster this time and somewhat louder, but it stays the same the entire time we're out. Maybe we were feeling brave, or maybe we were stupid, not mutually exclusive, but we stayed out for longer. Nothing happened, which is something I'm grateful for. After a little while though, the noise stopped. My boyfriend and I wondered what the noise could have been, but there were no theories other than something scary. We went 2 nights without the noise to our relief, but on the third, it came back. For whatever reason, with a vengeance. My boyfriend was just standing on my porch whistling a tune when the noise came back. It was louder than ever. Beforehand there were 10 to 15 seconds intervals between the barks, but now there were none. It was just barking constantly. It was still the same old recording, but louder and more aggressive. We went inside immediately. Skipping forward, it's been about a month since I last heard the noise. Before then it decreased in frequency, going from happening every night to roughly 4 nights a week to 2 nights a week and then gone. My boyfriend and I were so invested in this that we acted like a couple of idiots and investigated where the noise was coming from, but only in the daytime, of course. There was nothing there. No nest or anything, just dirt like everything else. I never found out what it was, and though I am very curious, I admit that a large part of me also doesn't really want to know out of fear. Senior year in high school, one guy I knew decided we needed to head into NYC to find fake IDs. Most of the group were lifelong suburban kids, but I grew up in the city, so hard a little more street smarts than the rest. So we're walking around, one kid in charge apparently thinking he's going to find a magical fake ID store somewhere. At some point some guy starts talking to him, and he says this guy know where we can get them, let's go. I knew this was a horrible idea, but followed the group. I start noticing more guys start coming out of nowhere, basically surrounding us. My friends were oblivious to this, but I knew this was a bad situation. At this point a real jumpy guy slides up next to me and says, "Yo, they said you need ID." At this point, I wanted out, and just said, "Nah man, I'm good, I'm just along for the ride." That pissed him off. He grabbed my arm, lifted his shirt to show me a huge knife shoved in his waistband, and said, "Give me $1 for wasting my time or I'll gut you like a fish." I'm like, okay, fair deal. Handed him $1 and he walked away. At that point we were walking past a subway stop and I yelled, "Subway, now!" and ran down the stairs. Eventually everyone followed. We got on the train and proceeded to argue for 20 minutes about whether we were all going to get led to some basement to get mugged and killed or if we were actually going to get fake IDs. I will preface this by saying that I am a non-religious skeptic who does not believe in the supernatural, but I have no explanation for these events. I'll try to keep this terse, because it was actually a series of events. They all occurred when I moved with my then legal guardian into a home in the CA Bay area many years ago. The first thing we noticed was that one of the rooms in the rear of the house was much colder than the rest of the house, to the point that it was constantly remarked upon. My room was directly across the hall from this cold room, which was set up for my guardian's son. My guardian's son would visit often, and the son was young, around age 6 or 7. When he would visit, he would sometimes be tired and cranky in the mornings, and when asked why, he would say, "I can't sleep because the man watches me at night." Fast forward some months. I wake in the middle of the night in my room with the certainty that someone is in my room with me, staring at me. My heart is absolutely pounding. I try not to move, or breathe, or do anything that would give away that I am there. Eventually, the feeling passes and I am able to sleep. Months later, I am in the kitchen cooking up a hot pocket or something in the microwave. I recall retrieving my food and turning around with the saucer in my hand and seeing before me a shadowy mass. Right in front of me. Just a non-distinct shadowy mass that shouldn't be there, hovering in air. I had enough time to register it before it moved directly towards me, and fast. I flinched hard, dropped my plate, and turned and ran out of the room. I often think of writing a letter to that address to ask the current inhabitants if they have experienced anything strange. When I was a teenager and my folks were out for the night, I went into the kitchen shortly around 10 in the evening just to get myself a drink of water. Suddenly, I get a very nasty chill down my spine which almost made me almost curl backwards. Then, the noise from outside. It sounded like a cat screeching from the bushes or even the squealing of tall trees brushing against each other in a forest during a strong wind, but it just didn't seem right, as though it were a good distance away at the same time. Keep in mind, in the house I was staying in had trees that stood just over a one-floor house only about 30 feet away. But this seemed to come off from about a mile away. Turns out that while I could hear it, my sisters didn't. But my cousins heard it as well, despite the fact that they were all about a good 5 miles away in a different village. Next morning, my mum gets a call from her sister about it, when both of them were interrupted by another sibling of theirs. Turns out that a great aunt of mine had a heart attack and passed away in her sleep. That is what convinced me that I heard a banshee that night. I went to a college in a very beautiful area where there was a lot of camping and hiking available. My boyfriend at the time and I would go camping often to get alone time. We would frequently go to a really beautiful, but isolated spot that wasn't part of an authorized campground. It could be reached by car, but you had to know where you were going to get there. One time we had planned to go camping, but because I had to work late, he went out early to the area to set up our tent and make camp. After I got off work, he picked me up and we headed out. When we got to our camp, he told me that something a little weird had happened. He said that when he was setting things up, another truck had pulled up on him and just stopped and watched him for a minute. He said he started to walk over to talk to the driver but it backed out of the camp area and took off. This kind of spooked me, but we decided it was probably someone who also liked our spot and realized he was setting up camp and not taking it down and they were just disappointed. I should mention that we were clearly naive. So we went about our business and eventually went to bed around midnight. I am a deep sleeper. Around 2:30 a.m. I woke up to my boyfriend whispering directly in my ear to wake up but not say a word. I could hear a larger engine vehicle close by. I wasn't too afraid, but then I heard a car door creak open and footsteps approaching steadily but slowly. All the hairs on my body stood up. We were quiet and I remember silently praying. The person circled our tent and then walked off, sat in their truck for a while and then left. Although my boyfriend wanted to stay, I convinced him that we should leave and come back in the day with friends to take down camp, as I was convinced that we didn't need to be there. We left all of our stuff. When we came back the next day to take everything down, we unzipped our tent and found that my bra and panties that I had left in my bag had been laid out on my sleeping bag as if it were placed there to represent my body. It was so creepy. To this day, I think something horrific would have happened if we would have stayed there. I still love to camp, but now only go to authorized camping zones. This happened in Ocean City, Maryland. So, I have a pretty severe panic disorder that developed in college. Slight anxiety attacks developed into full-blown panic attacks that would last for hours. Eventually I was housebound for nearly 2 years because even stepping outside would nearly make me collapse. It took years of very expensive therapy to basically retrain myself to live life again. Now, during this time I was about 3 to 4 years into a relationship with someone who had put up with my panic disorder but was starting to get fed up with me. I was once the kind of girl who would hop on a bus to go 3 states over just for the thrill of it, and now I could barely go to the city 5 minutes from my house. He loved the old me. I caught on to this pretty quick and tried my best to force myself to be the old me again. What better way to test my boundaries than a trip to the beach? I live in PA, so it's not like it's a million miles away, right? About one day in, bright and early in the morning, I wake up after hours of panic attacks and basically gobbling down a half a bottle of Xanax. I tell him, I need to go home. I can't do this. I can't do this. This was a family vacation, and his family had become my family after so many years of friendship and dating, but they were never really my family, if that makes sense. I vividly remember being out on the balcony, his eyes blazing brown, and him saying, absolutely not. You're not ruining my family vacation. You're not ruining this. And I couldn't be mad. Because that's exactly what I was doing. This was it, the final crack in a dying relationship. But when you're in a state of mind like that, all you can think of is, you need to get home, you need to get home, you need to be safe, please LD do anything to be safe. So my dumbass opened up my Uber app, set a 3.5-hour destination to my hometown, and within 10 minutes my boyfriend was helping me pack my bags into a stranger's trunk. I was zoinked out of mind on mood stabilizers and could barely look straight, but I'll never forget his face as that car drove away. I think a part of me died right there. So picture me, 20-something-year-old young woman, zapped in on a full panic, in the back of a stranger's car, heartbroken and basically lost in my life. Now the Uber driver. A short woman with wild beads in her hair and a shrine of Jesus in her passenger seat. We're about 10 minutes into our drive when she asks me, "Do you want to be saved, my child?" It's quiet for a minute. I'm trying to figure out if I'm hearing things at this point. She asks me again, this time looking over the seat while her car is going 70 on the highway. I parted my lips and I could literally hear them crack from how dry they were, as I hadn't eaten or drank anything in days. I say, "What do you mean?" And I hope I sound nice because I'm confused and scared and I just want to go home. She doesn't say anything else for an hour into the drive, and am grateful to use that time to get some rest. I wake up and we're parked at a gas station. She's filling up her tank and making eye contact with me the entire time. She looks concerned. I look concerned. We're both concerned. She gets back in her car, turns around, and immediately starts speaking Townges. At this point I'm honestly thinking that this is it. I had died in Ocean City, Maryland, and this was the ferry of the damned on its ride down to hell. She keeps getting louder and louder. We're blowing way past the speed limit at this point and she's hunched and jerking, just spitting out a chain of sounds. I open the back window because I can't breathe. Halfway through the screaming I take another pill and 15 minutes after that I fall back asleep. This time I wake up in my hometown, right in front of my house. She pops the trunk for me to get my bag, and gives a big hug. "You're safe now," she whispers to me, then gets back in her car and drives away. My boyfriend left me a few months after that. He didn't want to wait for me to get better. But that's a story for another time. It took me a long time to be able to travel again, but my current partner has been my rock. I feel like with a little more time I'll finally be able to visit other countries and actually see the world like I've always wanted to. Just this time maybe not from the back of a Uber. I'll set the scene. You go camping, and at midday you decide to take a nap in a nice little hammock. While sleeping, a tiny brown bat, in the rage stages of infection, is fidgeting in broad daylight, uncomfortable, and thirsty, due to the hydrophobia, and you snort, startling him. He goes into attack mode. Except you're asleep, and he's a little brown bat, so weighs around 6 grams. You don't even feel him land on your bare knee, and he starts to bite. His teeth are tiny. Hardly enough to even break the skin, but he does manage to give you the equivalent of a tiny scrape that goes completely unnoticed. Rabies does not travel in your blood. In fact, a blood test won't even tell you if you've got it. Antibody tests may be done, but are useless if you've ever been vaccinated. You wake up, none the wiser. If you notice anything at the bite site at all, you assume you just lightly scraped it on something. The bomb has been lit, and your nervous system is the wick. The rabies will multiply along your nervous system, doing virtually no damage, and completely undetectable. You literally have no symptoms. It may be 4 days, it may be a year, but the camping trip is most likely long forgotten. Then one day your back starts to ache. Or maybe you get a slight headache? At this point, you're already dead. There is no cure. The sole caveat to this is the Milwaukee Protocol, which leaves most patients dead anyway, and the survivors mentally disabled, and is seldom done. There's no treatment. It has a 100% kill rate. Absorb that. Not a single other virus on the planet has a 100% kill rate. Only rabies. And once you're symptomatic, it's over. You're dead. So what does that look like? Your headache turns into a fever, and a general feeling of being unwell. You're fidgety, uncomfortable, and scared. As the virus that has taken its time getting into your brain finds a vast network of nerve endings, it begins to rapidly reproduce, starting at the base of your brain, where your pons is located. This is the part of the brain that controls communication between the rest of the brain and body, as well as sleep cycles. Next you become anxious. You still think you have only a mild fever, but suddenly you find yourself becoming scared, even horrified, and it doesn't occur to you that you don't know why. This is because the rabies is chewing up your amygdala. As your cerebellum becomes hot with the virus, you begin to lose muscle coordination and balance. You think maybe it's a good idea to go to the doctor now, but assuming a doctor is smart enough to even run the tests necessary in the few days you have left on the planet, odds are they'll only be able to tell your loved ones what you died of later. You're twitchy, shaking, and scared. You have the normal fear of not knowing what's going on, but with the virus really fucking the amygdala, this is amplified 100-fold. It's around this time the hydrophobia starts. You're horribly thirsty, you just want water. But you can't drink. Every time you do, your throat clamps shut and you vomit. This has become a legitimate, active fear of water. You're thirsty, but looking at a glass of water begins to make you gag, and shy back in fear. The contradiction is hard for your hot brain to see at this point. By now, the doctors will have to put you on IVs to keep you hydrated, but even that's futile. You were dead the second you had a headache. You begin hearing things, or not hearing at all as your thalamus goes. You taste sounds, you see smells, everything starts feeling like the most horrifying acid trip anyone has ever been on. With your hippocampus long under attack, you're having trouble remembering things, especially family. You're alone, hallucinating, thirsty, confused, and absolutely, undeniably terrified. Everything scares the literal shit out of you at this point. These strange people in lab coats. These strange people standing around your bed crying, who keep trying to get you drink something and crying. And it's only been about a week since that little headache that you've completely forgotten. Time means nothing to you anymore. Funny enough, you now know how the bat felt when he bit you. Eventually, you slip into the dumb rabies phase. Your brain has started the process of shutting down. Too much of it has been turned to liquid virus. Your face droops. You drool. You're all but unaware of what's around you. A sudden noise or light might startle you, but for the most part, it's all you can do to just stare at the ground. You haven't really slept for about 72 hours. Then you die. Always, you die. And there's not one fucking thing anyone can do for you. Then there's the question of what to do with your corpse. I mean, sure, burying it is the right thing to do. But the fucking virus can survive in a corpse for years. You could kill every rabid animal on the planet today, and if 2 years from now, some moist, preserved, rotten hunk of used to be brain gets eaten by an animal, it starts all over. So yeah, rabies scares the shit out of me. And it's fucking everywhere. Long story as short as possibles. For reference, I'm 25F in English. I'm a journalist and go on press trips, which are organized by big tech companies and they pay for me to do everything. Literally every single trip has sorted everything out. Transfers from the airport, which is a chauffeur, etc. This one woman approached me on LinkedIn, which should have been the first red flag. And said she worked very closely the journalist who I replaced. We had a crossover of line a week. He did do a trip with this company, so seemed like it checked out. She then asked me if I booked my flights, etc. and I said sorry. Usually the companies pre-arrange that. They said no problem, they'll do it. Usually I'll get loads of contact details of all the PR people, check-ins, the chauffeur company, etc. but I received no details except my flight and hotel. I asked more about the transfer at the airport today and she says due to a strike in Belgium, she's cancelled all transfers and to just get an Uber. Seemed weird? How is that related? Was she just not going to tell me? When I landed at 23:30. Then I checked the Uber and it was €199, which I can't afford, frankly shouldn't have to, and TBH they shouldn't be expecting for a female journalist to just get an Uber in a foreign country at midnight anyways. I know that seems dramatic, but that's just how it's done. It just all started seeming really, really weird, and I hadn't had any contact with anyone else in the company, so I reached out to the former journo, who told me I can honestly say I've never heard or spoke to her. Which was just the final red flag. That's what she based the whole thing on. It doesn't help that my pre-trip fun fact about Malaga was that it's only 30 miles away from Morocco/Albania. Either in those areas have higher crime rates than what I am personally used to. I've since checked with the official company, and there's no event on their website. I got the first flight home instead, reached out to the woman just in case I was being dramatic or paranoid, expressing my concerns, and said this led to me not feeling safe, and she dismissed it all and asked if I wanted to meet up for drinks to make up for it. I said I returned home. She never replied and now she's blocked me. Few weeks ago I was sleeping in my apartment. I have 4 roommates, and one of them must have forgot to lock the door. So I wake up at 4 a.m., I don't know why or what made me, and I see this absolutely huge 6'3" figure in my doorway messing with the mic on my mic stand. I process this and I come to the conclusion that it is not one of my roommates. So fight or flight kicks in cause I'm cornered in my room. I'm only a 19-year-old male, very tall but not huge size-wise. I stand up and we lock eye contact, then I just run at him yelling at him to get out of my house. All this my brain didn't even process, it just did. He runs out of the house and I lock the door behind him. Call the cops to file a report and went back to bed cause I had an 8 a.m. class. Shout out the roommates for being high as balls and leaving the door unlocked. Thankful that it wasn't worse. But that was one of those we bout to die situations. Like damn, I'm the 1% this is happening to. Great. I was at a friend's house to watch The Ring for the first time. We were 14 girls alone in her bedroom with all the curtains shut and lights off for the atmosphere. We're about halfway through the movie where they replay the video from start to end. As soon as the video ended in the movie, my friend's house phone rang. We just looked at each other, mildly terrified like WTF? We paused the movie and my friend answered the phone, but there was nothing but white noise on the other end. She hangs up and we're freaking out a little at this point, but reassure ourselves that it's all fine and press OK on the movie again. As soon as we press OK, on phone rings again. My friend answers it and again it's a lot of white noise, but there's time we hear a very faint, hoarse and broken up "I'm coming. I'm coming now." Well, not we're absolutely fucking terrified, think that the ring is actually coming to get us. Just as we're trying to reassure each other, her front door, which had been locked, slams open. We peer around the corner and down the stairs, but there's nobody there. We creep down and close the door, then go into her living room to see if someone had come in the house. The door slams open again and no one is there. At this point we're just staring at the entrance to the living room, waiting for an axe murderer or creepwell girl to come kill us. That's when my friend's dad walks in with arms full of shopping, going, "Come on. I rang and told you I was coming with shopping so you could help me unload the car. What's wrong? You look really pale?" Turns out his phone signal had been absolutely awful and it was just a coincidence when he called. Then he'd got home, flung open the front door and immediately went round the corner to the car. The driveway was on the side of the house so we couldn't see the car. When he saw us close the door, he rolled his eyes and flung it open again. Now it's a fun anecdote for us to laugh at, but at the time, we genuinely thought a girl was gonna crawl out the TV. I don't exactly remember what started the fight, most likely him wanting to have sex and me not wanting to. But I remember a point where he'd gotten right in my face. I responded by shoving him back away from me. He responded by grabbing me in the throat, lifting me off of the ground and slamming me down into the tile. I was lucky my back hit first and not my head. The day I finally realized my life was in danger, because apparently being chokeslammed like it's WWE wasn't enough for me, I had sought him out after avoiding him for days, would spend as much time as I could in the plaza near downtown Querétaro, by a church that had Wi-Fi. I was looking for him to borrow the house key where we were both staying because I wanted to make a copy for myself so I didn't have to find him to go home. He was completely shit-faced at 2 in the afternoon and we got into a screaming match out on the street. He didn't want to give me the key and I refused to back down. Finally, in a huff, he dumped the contents of his pockets with a fine. I bent down to grab the key and stood up in time to see him haul off and punch me in the gut as hard as he could. I was luckily tensing my abs almost non-stop at that point because of the constant stress, so he didn't knock the wind out of me. I kicked him backwards onto his ass and screamed something at him. I can't remember what. What I do remember is looking down the street and seeing 2 older ladies just staring at us. And it was in that moment I realized, if he was so willing to brazenly hit me as hard as he could in broad daylight in front of witnesses, there was absolutely nothing stopping him from doing much worse from what he'd already done. I reached out to my mom and told her I didn't feel safe and I needed to get out. Bless her soul, she got me a ticket out of there within 2 weeks of the incident, the longest almost 2 weeks of my life. If your partner, or really anyone in your life, puts their hands on you, please truly know that it never gets better, it always gets worse, and you don't deserve to be in that kind of a situation. For your own sake, get away from them and put as much distance between you as possible. I was at a big state fair with my 1 and 3-year-old. My 3-year-old gave me her water to put in the stroller. I took 3 steps and turned around, and she disappeared. After 15 to 20 seconds I went full frantic. We were in a large tented area and I was screaming her name, running around like a lunatic. My parents were helping look for her too. I decided to check the far corner of the area and there she was, walking away with a dirty older lady. I ran up to them and firmly grabbed my daughter from her. She was like, "What's wrong?" We were walking to security. It still haunts me. She was gone for 60 seconds max. I don't know how long she was with this lady, but it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds and she's walking away. I think about it almost daily. Driving from Pennsylvania to Arizona a few years back, no hotel stops along the way, just me and 2 friends taking turns at the wheel for a 35-hour drive. We finally crossed the state line and enter Oz after nearly 2 days of straight driving with minimal stops for food/fuel/ etc. It's about 1 a.m. and we're running low on gas. The only gas station for miles that is listed as being open online is located about 3 miles inside of Petrified Forest National Park. We don't have any other options, we decide to check it out. My friend is driving, other friend is riding passenger, I'm in the back seat, they're both women, I'm the one male in the car. Soon as we drive into the park, we're wondering how the hell there's an open gas station in here. It's pitch black, no cars in sight, the park is clearly unoccupied. The only source of light on our 3-ish mile drive to our destination was our headlights. Miraculously, we pull up to a gas station buried inside this park. There's no attendant, the store is locked, but the pump is lit. My friend pulls over, it's a tight squeeze, small gas station, and my friends joke that I should be the one to pump the gas since I'm the only man in the car. It's really because none of us want to step outside, we're all feeling creeped out about the atmosphere we've driven into. I get out, The pump accepts my card, and start filling up the tank. As soon as I start fueling up, we see lights approaching from the distance. Let me restate that there had been no lights whatsoever beside our headlights and the faint glow of the gas pump at the station. We could see the blackness of night stretching for miles in this park. There had been nobody on the narrow road with us the whole time we were driving in. Where were these lights coming from, if we hadn't seen them until the second I exited the car? I say to my friends through the window, must be a park ranger. I realize as I'm saying this that I'm verbalizing it to calm myself down rather than because I think it's true. Lights get closer, they're blinding, high beams are on, shining directly at me as they pull into the station. Eventually they get close enough that I can make out the vehicle. It's a random RV, not a park ranger. I see a man in the front seat, skinny, glasses, mustache, baseball cap, white guy, that's how I remember him, and there's nobody else in the vehicle with him. I assume that he's gotta be in the same boat as us, tank running low, no place to stop for gas, no choice but to fill up at the park. But he drives around the unoccupied pump and faces his RV in our direction, for no apparent reason. At this point I can see his eyes, we're close enough that I'm looking at the driver clearly as I'm filling up the tank. He smiles at me as he continues to inch his vehicle closer to ours, moving at a speed so slow that it was like he was trying to provoke us. He's getting closer, closer, why isn't he stopping? He's about to hit us while we're immobilized and he's driving less than 5 miles per hour, so my friend in the passenger seat builds up the courage to reach over and honk the horn to tell him to stop. The sound of that horn, cutting the tension of the absolute silence of the night, will stick with me forever. At this point I was looking not only at the RV, but also through the window at my friends. Without words, we're all communicating our extreme horror and confusion at the situation unfolding in front of us. The RV stops, just yards away from our car, and the man waves at me again, almost apologetically, with a smile. We're not fully fueled, but I know that I'm not comfortable standing at that pump any longer, so I hang it up and hop back in the car. I don't even have to say let's get out of here. As soon as I close the door my friend is already starting to move the car. RV guy has at this point positioned himself in such a way that it is impossible for us to drive straight out of the station because he's blocking our path forward. Our only choice is to reverse into the forest, eat the unpaved, non-drivable forest, and angle ourselves out from there. We eventually do it while the RV guy sits there, staring at us, still not moving to exit his vehicle or fuel it. We get out, start driving as fast as we can on that narrow path out of the park, and keep checking behind us to see if we're being followed. We weren't. It looked like the RV turned its headlights off as soon as we left. We didn't discuss what had happened until we knew we were 100% safe and back on the highway. When we finally were able to approach the situation, we realized that the RV must have been camped out in the blackness of the forest with its lights out, waiting for someone to approach the pump. We would have seen the headlights otherwise, it would have been too black not to have noticed them. We have no idea what would have happened if we hadn't honked that horn, if we had let him slowly inch his way closer and hit our car. Would he have said sorry, let's all get out of the car and check the damage and then tried something on us? Would he have lured us out in the open so we didn't have the protection of the car? Was he alone in the RV? We will never know, and I'm damn sure glad that we didn't stick around to find out. So I was dating a girl in my early 20s. We went on a road trip to California when she started displaying symptoms of schizophrenia. She would be normal as fuck all day and then all of a sudden just shift in vibe. So one night I'm with her and we're staying alone in this little building on a farm, while doing a work trade. She was having normal conversation with me when all of a sudden she freezes and stares past me with a terrified look on her face. It's right behind you, yeah, fuck that man. I was so scared. I look behind me, find nothing and ask her what she saw. She doesn't explain. Then starts saying bad things about herself and spiraling more and more negative with her thoughts. Then her pupils widen in an instant like she just got eye drops put in. Then I notice she goes to grab a knife off the side table. I quickly grab her wrist of the hand with the knife and wrestle her down to the ground. I eventually got the knife from her without her being able to do anything with it. The craziest part was how strong this person was. I had probably 60 pounds on this 110 pounds chick and she was putting up a hell of a fight trying to keep the knife. Man, that was a road trip from hell. This past September, my family and I went on vacation to a small island in North Carolina. We had visited and stayed on this island many times throughout my childhood and teen years, so I was very familiar with it and was excited to be back after having not been there for over a decade. One night, my family and I were hanging out on the back porch having some drinks and talking late into the night. Just as everyone was cleaning up and getting ready to head to bed, I happened to walk outside and noticed how incredible the stars were. I live in the suburbs outside of a big city, so I can see about 20 stars on a good night, but the entire sky here was filled with stars. I called to my sister and we both stood in awe as everyone else went to bed. That's when we both decided we wanted to hop on our bikes and go for a late night ride. I'm 28 and my sister is 36, but something about creeping out of the house without telling anyone made us both feel like teenagers again. We rode off down the island laughing and looking up at the stars before deciding to stop at the opposite end of the island and just enjoy the view and talk for a while. It was empty and quiet on the island as it was almost 4 a.m. We hadn't seen any other person this entire time. We finally decide to start biking back and we're not really talking much anymore as we focus on heading back. We start rounding a bend getting closer to our house when I see up ahead, under the only streetlight on the road, a man standing by himself on the side of the road. Before I can even process what I'm seeing, he starts walking towards the middle of the road and stops dead center in the street staring at us as we approach. My sister is a little bit ahead of me, so I try to warn her without being too loud, but she just responds with, "Huh? I don't see anyone." I'm watching her and I bike closer and I feel my heart racing, so I repeat myself again to my sister. She still doesn't process that I'm scared, so I yell at her and she finally stops. We're about 20 feet away from the guy and I'm saying to my sister that I'm freaked out by this guy in the middle of the street up ahead and I don't know what to do, and that's when I see him slowly walk back towards the edge of the street again and disappear out of view. In a panic, I make the quick decision to just pedal for my life past this guy and get home. However, as I'm going past the spot in the road where he was, I look over and I don't see anyone at all. I still have no idea where he could have gone. We made it home safe and it's been a funny story to tell people, but I still have no clue what that guy was doing or what his intentions were on this empty island at 4 a.m. I was part of a small drum corps in Texas back in '06. We were on tour and got around in 3 15-passenger vans. This was before Google Maps. Our driver had a set of directions from MapQuest. One night, we were on a small 2-lane highway in central TX. It's 2 a.m. Next thing we know, we're no longer on a highway. We're on a dirt road, and the driver isn't sure how he got there in the first place. We end up pulling into a trailer town. It is very dark. The town, if you could call it that, was a couple square blocks of trailers and campers, and one brick 2-story building that looks like a convenience store. There's only one light on, and it's the mosquito control light inside the brick building. We start noticing eyes looking at us in every direction, glowing red and orange. Hundreds of pairs of eyes. We are genuinely freaked out. Driver pops on the high beams, and we realize the entire town is covered in live deer. I mean hundreds of deer. They're on top of cars, on top of campers, in yards, on the side streets, and lining the side of the dirt road we were on. And not a single one moved. Not an ear wiggle, not a ground scratch, nothing. They just stared at us. The only time they moved was to turn their heads to keep looking at our vans as we slowly, very slowly, drove past. There were no people. No other lights aside from that mosquito trap and our headlights. Despite deer being on top of trailers and in truck beds and on top of sedans, not a single person was awake in this trailer park. I still think about that night. I thought I dreamed it, but friends from back then remember this night. We used to joke that the deer were actually the residents of the town and at night they transform into ungulates. Lol. It was just uncanny. Unreal. Never seen anything close to that again. We drove through just fine and ended up back in civilization, but we could never explain what we saw or why there were so many freaking live deer in this trailer park. I was with my boyfriend's family on a trip somewhere in Alabama. We took a jet ski to a waterfall, very romantic, yada yada. But to get close to the waterfall, we had to get off the jet ski and climb over quite a bit of slippery rocks. On the way back, I didn't think I could make it without falling, so I decided to try to go around the rocks instead. It was longer but looked maybe less dangerous. I'm wading through a shallow pool and I see something. About 10 feet ahead on a flat rock sticking out of the water is a perfectly white, picked clean deer skull staring at me. Creepy, but not unbelievable because there are a lot of deer in that area. Then I looked down in the water. It appeared to be standing up. A headless deer body, not picked clean like the skull. Still covered with its fur. No visible blood in the water. Just standing, swaying ever so gently with the movement of the water. I noped the fuck out of there and took my chances with the slippery rocks. I was about 20 at the time and was back home from college on a visit. My friend Ian and I were having a few drinks and entertaining 2 girls we knew from high school. As 2 romantic hopefuls not quite old enough to go to the bar, we opted to go drink at a secluded beach we knew of. To get to said beach required walking through a thick forested area, and despite it being dark everyone seemed fine with the idea. We head on over and began our trek, something we had done without incident several times. However, this time we immediately realized something was off. There were no frogs or bugs, the forest was silent, absolutely nothing but a calm stillness. Ian and I quietly mentioned to each other that this usually meant a predator is around, but we'd had a few at this point and decided we were probably the scariest thing out there. We continued down the path quietly, but on a slightly heightened alert. Then we noticed the smell. The forest smelled off, almost like a mixture of dirty clothes and bad breath. Again, we are concerned, but at this point we are almost there, so there was no sense in turning back. The last part of the path cut through a marsh lowland that connected the barrier island to the mainland. It is admittedly creepy as fuck with old winding trees covering the path. What little light we had from the moon was now being blotted out by a twisted latticework of branches. We begin to traverse this path and are about midway through when I heard it, a pronounced mechanical click, like a Snapple bottle cap being popped. Ian and I froze, and before we could localize where the noise came from, we heard it again from a different direction. There was a brief pause, and then the forest simply stood up. A dozen figures vaguely silhouetted by moonlight stood and began to move towards us from all directions. Without hesitation, Ian took off in a full sprint. I go to follow, but pull back after deciding I couldn't leave the girls alone to be murdered. As they realized what was happening, they began to scream, the kind of scream you only let out when you are absolutely sure you're fucked. As I grabbed them to get them positioned to run, I turned and the path was now blocked by obscured figures. It was game over, no way out, hopelessly outnumbered by figures that didn't even appear to be human. I kept the girls behind me and got ready to make my last stand. I was terrified, but the adrenaline rush kept me calm. The figure closest to us ceased its advance. An arm reached up from its center mass and pulled off a helmet that had foliage strapped to it, revealing a man's painted face. He began to speak as I stood before him in utter disbelief. He identified himself as an officer of the Marine Corps and explained they sometimes run war games on this stretch of land, which I learned is public access but owned by the Navy. They were unsure if we were part of the exercise or not, hence why they advanced. He began to apologize profusely, but I was so relieved to be alive at this point I could not have cared less. As they escorted us back, all the weirdness of the woods began to make sense. The silence, the smell, those clicks, all a result of a platoon of leathernecks creeping in the shadows. On our path back, several other smaller groups that had stayed in cover made themselves known, including a pair that had stopped Ian's dumbass from running all the way back to Baltimore. Needless to say, the trip back home was awkward and the girls were quite unhappy with Ian's reaction at us, with the help of the Marine Corps, accidentally traumatizing them. Up until that officer removed his helmet, I truly believed we were in the midst of a horror movie. When I was living in my parents' house, my bedroom had this closet that sat directly opposite my bed. For whatever reason I can't remember, the door couldn't close. That closet had always given me bad vibes, and I almost never slept, but the worst was one night when I was home alone. I was laying in bed trying to sleep, when suddenly it got eerily quiet. I was home alone, but I could typically hear nighttime sounds coming from outside. As I lay there trying to rationalize, I started to hear some whispering. At first I couldn't make it out, but then I recognized it as my name. Obviously freaked out, I was nearly paralyzed with fear. I sat there for what felt like forever, when I felt what felt like a thin finger, slowly tracing down my foot from toes to heel. The rest of that night is honestly a blur, but I remember having this super strong urge to look into the closet. I'm happy I never did. Still not sure what happened that day, but here it goes. 5 or 6 years ago I was rewiring a very old house with an older friend and foreman at the time, Jim. This house was so old we had many restrictions on what we could and couldn't do. It was a part of the historical homes in the community, so it was a big deal. Which just means all of the wiring was slow and steady. So one day when I was in the attic pulling wires around for some new lights and Jim was in the room below so I would know where the wires needed to go, I heard a woman asking, "Hello?" Twice I heard this coming from the attic access, which someone entering the house would have to pass to get to the room we were working on. I didn't respond because I was in a tough spot and figured the lady would walk into the next room over to talk to Jim. I mean, we were expecting some people to stop by in a bit anyway, so nothing out of the normal. I climbed down from the attic after getting my wires where they needed to go, and asked Jim, "Where's the lady?" "What lady?" "Jim, the lady who just got here and was calling hello up the ladder." "Me what?" "There hasn't been any lady here and I didn't hear any lady." "Jim, you were messing with, right?" "Me no, unless she slipped by me. But I definitely didn't hear anyone. It has been very quiet though, so I could hear you in the attic." "Jim." So then we cleared the house, checked the street, looked for cars, and nothing. No people, no lady, just us in an old empty house. An old house that before this I had found very old pictures of children and people hidden in secret rooms built in the attic. An old house that made everyone uncomfortable if the lights were off and you were alone. And I mean everybody. After we check out everything, lunchtime comes, and I have to leave to go to another project. Leaving Jim to put in the lights I had pulled the wires to earlier. Fast forward to the next day when I had almost forgot about everything. At almost the end of the day Jim brings up the lady again. And begins to explain what happened after I had left. That afternoon after the owners and some guests had visited, he had to get back into the attic to add another wire. Jim alone in this house in the attic nearly the same spot that I was, hears a lady's voice asking, "Hello?" No longer thinking I'm crazy he gets down out of the attic as quick as possible searching for this lady or whatever it was. He opens the front door to find a woman walking back towards the road from the front door. He calls after her to figure out what was going. Sure enough she was the neighbor and wanting to see how the remodel was going. At this point I feel very relieved, mystery solved, right? So Jim starts laughing when he realizes it was her that I must have heard earlier through the soffit next to me and mistaken it for the ladder. So then Jim apologizes to her for us not answering the door when she stopped by earlier in the day. Jim looks at me very concerned and I'm sure I had the same confused look that she did. When she told Jim, "No, I didn't stop by earlier, I've been out of town the last couple days and just got back this afternoon. To this day I still don't like that house, and I'm not sure what happened, but I can still recall that voice clearly asking, 'Hello?'